Thank you. Thanks everyone for having me here. Thank you, Dr. Echo for Professor Echo for that great welcome remarks. I think I'm going to tie a lot of the discussion that I want to have in this presentation to what you mentioned. Um, so this presentation is actually, I would say, a consolidation of different works that I've done over the years. And usually we'd like to think that research is motivated by scientific inquiry. This research is motivated by spite, by revenge. I wanted to start with an anecdote where I talked to an Asian Development Bank official, and we're having this discussion about policy capacity. And one thing that he said to me that quite struck me was that the problem in developing countries in the global south is that we are poor implementers of policy. Like we create the best policy design, but we can't implement it. And he was quick to say that, yeah, in my work in ADB, a lot of my projects require changes that are unrealistic, including the opposition party winning the elections. So that struck me. And as someone who worked from the government before, I realized that a lot of the sort of expectations around what kind of policies we should be having really comes from these unrealistic standards of what we expect out of the change that should happen. Um, and that's why I started to look into this research, really looking into uh, are we really bad implementers or are we really just bad at design? So for this presentation, I'll probably just get into the first two, more as a way to kind of jumpstart the discussion around the need for second best policies. But hopefully I'll be able to uh, incorporate some of the discussion around a case that I've been working on in the Philippines, which is essentially a poverty reduction program, which is a conditional cash transfer program. But in case that I lost you somewhere along the presentation, these are the three things that I wanted to remember. First is that I wanted to make this as a call to move beyond looking purely at implementation as a sort of driver of policy failure. Rather, we need to start thinking about this unrealistic, overly optimistic standards are in policy design. Uh, and second, we need to understand how certain conditions actually should force us to think about second best designs rather than first best design. And lastly, I wanted to think about what was earlier mentioned, that there is some dynamics to policy design. And there is going to be some shifting around the design. And that, I think, is the nature of second best policy design. So we need not be too heavily invested in sort of this ideal standards of what a policy should be. Rather, we should be more adaptable and flexible. So going back to what really motivated me, it's like that happened 10 years ago, and that's around the same time that the World Bank released this World Bank Development Report. And a lot of what we're talking about in terms of this unrealistic standard is encapsulated this question. They were asking, why are carefully designed policies not often adopted or implemented? And I label this as the implementation paradox because the question really comes from the fact that we've been giving so much money. We have a lot of resources to these policies, and they are well designed. They are the best in the world. They're the best available solution. But why are they're not implemented properly? And I call this implementation paradox because as a result of this focus on poor implementation, many scholars have argued that implementation is the most important aspect of the policy process. And so for me, I wanted to link it back to this picture. Like, is this an issue of implementation? So if you trip in the stairs, is it an issue of the one who's walking, or is it the issue of the design? No, so you can kind of, if you say that I'm the one who's at fault and tripping on the stairs, I think I've been gaslighted. And I think this is an issue of bad design. And no amount of improving education to the people who are walking would probably solve the design issue. So we need to look into how to improve this design and to think about better ways of understanding policy design beyond our current thinking about it. And so why do we need to worry about this narrative of poor implementation. It's quite small here, but I hope our colleagues from Zoom are able to better read through it. Just looking at the charts on your right, maybe on the one on the bottom, uh, there is this narrative of governments from the global south as poor implementers, but actually, if you look into a lot of the development projects, we're actually not that bad. So the first chart on that, if you would see that those are World Bank finance projects. Around 70% of World Bank finance projects are deemed moderately satisfactory or highly satisfactory. So in some ways, if you consider data as a measure of success, 70% of world projects are actually pretty successful. If you also look at the second table there, that looks into ADB projects. Um, if you look into how they define success here, regardless of programs or projects, more than 60% is quite successful. And of course, it depends on how we define success. If you want 100% success, again, that's overly optimistic. And so a lot of my colleagues, Mike Howlett and Nihit Goyal, started to look into the documents of evaluation studies. And what they found here is that a lot of those that are unsuccessful have this kind of narrative that the design is the problem. They say like it is probably financially unviable, economically unviable, overly ambitious considering the resources available and also the time it should take to actually implement it. And so while I'm talking about development projects here, the same is the case for our discussions around public policies in the global south. We tend to be overly optimistic. Think about our development plans. So when I started living outside the Philippines, I realized the Netherlands doesn't have a development plan. Australia doesn't have this large scale, long term, medium term planning. And I argue, allows for strategic thinking, but also allows for this overly ambitious thinking that probably we won't be able to deliver on these targets or these outputs. And so, how do we then think about better policy design? How do we think about design in the context of such context? You can find already a lot of the thinking in the existing policy design studies in terms of the distinction between what they would call the first best design and the second best design. So think about your own context of development plans. I would argue that an example of a first best design. It is the ideal configuration of policies that would eventually lead to progress or poverty reduction. It is assumed to be born out of a sophisticated process of policy formulation, and I would argue that it represents what I would call what's been called the collective optimum, the best available technology that we can use for policies to really drive certain outcomes. And there's value to first best design. It gives us aspiration, it gives us long-term thinking, it gives us strategic direction. But I think focusing too much on the first best designs are probably problematic and probably harmful. And I'll try to talk about that later on. Second best design, on the other hand, is really when this first best configuration of policy are refracted through the local conditions of the country. So think of these development plans. When you try to refract that through the local policy process, that would lead to the second best design, or what they call the real world design, when it is confronted by already existing policy legacies, institutional inertias, something they would call policy histories, where policy doesn't exist on a vacuum. So whenever you introduce a new policy, such as, for example, the free school program, it will always be confronted with existing practices. And unlike the first best design, when you view this from a linear perspective, that this is the goal, we identify an instrument, this is more messy in the second best design, where we try to account for bargaining to sort of resolve certain trade-offs that occur when this ideal first design is sort of juxtaposed or goes against existing policy landscapes. So thinking about this, like, what are these conditions now that would go against this first best design? And this is where I think where my idea of generalizing to the broader set of global South cases, including Indonesia, for example, I also work on Brazil, matters. In the sense that these are conditions that are probably more pronounced in the context of global South. It also exists in other countries for sure, but I think the intensity of these concepts are much more higher than our global North counterparts. And so just want to illustrate here like how first best design essentially happened. It's really this matching of both the substantive aspect, the policy content, and the procedural element, the decision-making aspect between the tools and the goals. So we, of course, want to solve certain problems by using certain tools, right? It could be a subsidy, it could be a free school meal, which is essentially a mandate from the government that, all school children should be eating at some point. So, but these, when adopted in certain countries, are confronted by two conditions. The first one is ambiguity, where when there are unclear technology, whether the means and relationship is largely untested. And usually when we introduce new policies, this is the case. We don't know if it's going to work. Second one is whether the people, the politician, the public are going to accept it, whether they want it, whether they value these policies to begin with. So it's kind of reflected in the goals. Usually, I come from the Philippines, and my experience in working as a government official in the Philippines was that we relate a lot of policies to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the SDGs are largely uncontroversial, right? So we want to, and these are fairly ambiguous, but also ambitious goals. And that's the case here, where there is a lot of sort of lack of clarity in values. We want to engage in more what they would call polysemic ideas, where it can attract different sort of ideas, an agreement to a certain idea. And the second condition is policy conflict, where one, policies could actually dethrone certain actors in the position, and whether there is sort of this agreement that we should be doing it to begin with among the subsystem. So these two conditions, I would argue, sets the second best policy design different from the first best policy design. And one could just ideally think about it from the intensity, the relative intensity. Certain policies would have low conflict. So for example, in the Philippines, when they adopted what they call Anti-Red Tape Act, it was a low conflict scenario because it's against the government. So the losers are essentially the government. And so so there's hardly, it's uncontroversial policy. There could be also like high levels of ambiguity. Whether or not, for example, you adopted a new policy, let's say, for example, in social protection, there's something we call graduation of the ultra poor, where you give employment services to the extreme poor. And the idea is you allow them to become entrepreneur. And that's been the case when a certain program was adopted in Bangladesh called GUP, and was adopted eventually in India. But they didn't have the same level of labor market conditions. So the policy failed, despite the fact that in Bangladesh it worked. So this kind of like scale of ambiguity and conflict should be factored in when we think about design. And the key implication of this is that if we want to think about second best design, it's not just purely governed by effectiveness or like in the sense of whether or not we're able to achieve the most out of a policy, but it's actually relationality, whether it's able to preserve and sustain existing relationship that exists in the policy subsystem. So that's probably a little too broad at this point. Let's make it a little broader. And so in this discussion that there are varying degrees of conflict and ambiguity, my suggestion here is that we can think about it in terms of varying types of second best policy design. In the context where there's low levels of ambiguity, it's tried and tested, and low levels of conflict, usually there's no established loser. We would expect that the bureaucracy will hold over the policy design. It is consistent to the interests of the bureaucracy, and this is something we would call an administrative design, where it's fully specified. When you think about both the substantive and the procedural elements of the policy, when the technology, when the policy is largely untested, uh, there will be, but also low levels of conflict. There will be an element of experimentation happening, where you would kind of identify it provisionally first, and then sort of scale it up, maybe add new different elements to it. This is, I would argue, as expert driven, because the experiments are usually done by by experts. There is, and I think when we move towards the second part of the framework, high levels of policy conflict actually brings out the policy making outside the government, no, because we want to legitimize it by incorporating different stakeholders. So in high conflict, low ambiguity setup, we have what I would call a political design, where it is highly externalized. You bring different stakeholders to co-design the policy with you. Um, and it's largely underspecified to allow for this inclusive policy approach. And lastly, the symbolic design is really sort of for the sake of having a policy where you actually incorporate a lot of instruments, incorporate a lot of goals. It's actually too specified to the point that it's probably not going to be effective. So the idea of putting this together is one to suggest that there are different ways when we can think of design depending on the existing conditions, and it has implications on how we understand effectiveness. One of the other things that I wanted to make to establish here is that whereas the first best design is concerned with this effectiveness, whether it's going to work, and it's really about this attaching whether the instrument is appropriate, whether it's sufficient. Second best policy design is really more concerned about the process of policymaking. So we're less concerned with the substantive aspect. The idea here is we want to make things work through better decision making, through better policy design. I have probably like 2 seconds left. No, 2 minutes. Uh, to I wanted to just quickly talk about an example of a poverty reduction program in the Philippines to just sort of cap off this very abstract discussion. The idea here is that I wanted to trace the policy design life cycle to suggest that even for a single policy, the dynamics of design could actually go through all of these four dimensions. And I'm using the example here of what we call 4Ps, the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, which is a quintessential conditional cash transfer program. And I showed here as a point of comparison the PKH, which is also the Indonesian version of conditional cash transfer program. And what you would see here is there are similar elements to them, right? They were both introduced in 2007, similar levels of goals, similar instruments in the sense that they want to achieve to register the poor through proxy means testing and target certain types of targeting. And the idea here is that the first best design came from what we would call an instrument constituency, the World Bank, UNDP, these sort of like international actors that package both the instrument and the goals. So that's why it's similar, because it came from the same cabinet, so to speak. So that is the first best design, that it was meant to promote social development and social assistance at the same time. So it started more as an experimental design because a lot of the consultants, including this guy, I hope he doesn't see this. This is Tarcisio Castaneda. He was the consultant both for Indonesia and the Philippines. Hence, there is a similarity to the program design. And the idea here is that when the moment that the CCT was scaled up, it was evolved, it was transformed from an experimental design largely driven by experts, largely driven by consultants, to the government's agenda. And so this is essentially addressing this high ambiguity element. The moment that the government said, like, oh, we did a pilot test first for 300 households, it kind of worked. And so we're going to scale it up. Then it moved to this administrative design by reducing the ambiguity around the design. But during the time when Duterte came, there was high levels of ambiguity and high levels of conflict, in the sense that the government wanted to remove the program. And I had this discussion earlier, like what happened to PKH? It says like, oh yeah, each government would have their own pet project. That's what the government wanted here as well. But surprisingly, the program actually is remarkably durable. It survived Duterte's plan to remove it. So you would see here that there was plans of abolishing it. There were already certain alternatives available in terms of reducing poverty. And they actually peddled a discourse around the fact that the poor are lazy and the poor are undisciplined. So this kind of narrative questioned whether the program is acceptable to the public. And you can see that there is this increasing amount of grievances. So in the Philippines, this program allows for public to report the beneficiaries for misbehavior. And that can take them out of the list of the poverty. So this kind of uncertainty produced by the president about labeling the poor as undeserving, the program actually has that element, this procedural instrument to address this ambiguity. In the years that happened, there was an increase in grievances. The increase is really related to the fact that they are misbehaving. It received a lot of grievances from non-beneficiaries to the point that it became a national scandal. You know, there were issues of the poor using the money for gambling. Uh, but because they have this system of like, you can essentially take away a poor from the list of beneficiaries, this actually somehow allowed the program to survive. So in some ways, there is this process by which certain instruments allow for the resolution and the management of the ambiguities. Eventually, it eventually led to the institutionalization of the program in 2019, where it was finally passed as a law. And because it's now a law, it's no longer subject to these kinds of the vagaries of the political discussion. And just to quickly summarize, the idea here is that this second best policy design remained fairly durable. There is contestation. It's a controversial program. We don't know if it's effective, but it's effective in terms of allowing children to go to school, allowing health checkups. And the idea here is that you move from this experimental design and you move to this administrative design. Certain issues make it a high conflict scenario, and then it goes back to this kind of design, which again questions the extent to which it is effective or not. So I wanted to just quickly end with, I've been over by 15 minutes already, to come up with certain prescriptions. One is that we need to be able to manage ambiguity in the context of policy design. So in terms of introducing procedural tools to collect political knowledge in this context, a grievance mechanism, we use global evidence and actually pilot to reduce this uncertainty around the means and ends relationship. Of course, I think emphasizing the idea of monitoring evaluation, but I think it's also important to talk about how we manage conflict. So policy design needs to incorporate its conflict resolution mechanism, where you either use government routines. In the context of the Philippines, we have a lot of budget hearings, and this is a way by which we resolve conflicts. And lastly, we want to also build these commitment devices. And talking about Professor Echo about discussion about integration, the list of beneficiaries, we call them listahanan, has been used to coordinate other social services, including health insurance, including entrepreneurship. And sort of allows the program to be durable because it's quintessential to the delivery of other services. So that's it. I just wanted to sort of try to give you that idea that we need to think about social policy, policy design, in the second best way possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kidjie, for the very outstanding and meaningful presentation for us. Um, I don't want to dominate the speech here because this is a brown bag discussion, meaning that an interactive one, we need to develop it. So for the rest of the time in our session here, uh, I'd like to give chance to every one of us. Let's, from heart to heart, let's share and discuss about what Dr. Kidjie has just said about the first and the second best policy design, because we have kinds of problematic situations that he has just addressed as well in terms of energy scarcity right now that we are still having because of the global tensions, and then a lot of poverty alleviation programs that the government is still running in terms of education sector as well. In Indonesia's background, we have Sekolah Garuda, Sekolah Rakyat, and a lot of Sekolah Reguler and so forth. So this is a part of the discussion for us. So I think in order to strengthen the concept that has just stated by Dr. Kidjie, it is the time for us to share. Everyone who attend online will also give chance to have your own time to say something. Yes, please, Pak.
Okay, my name is Heri Fatur Rahman from Business Administration Department. I think it's of interest to talk about public policy, especially in global south. But I don't have data about global south. But I think we have referred to in case in Indonesia about public policy. Not only in Indonesia we have the best public policy, but that's you said that a poor implementation, but sometimes we can also to see about intervention from our public administrator or leader or the president until the major about public policy. And then when you explain about first public policy design and the second public policy design, when we must to choose the first one or the second one, and then how we can to measure about if we fail in the first one, and then we try to get the second public policy design, and how to measure about the instrument of the about the indicator of the first and the second, especially if we refer in Indonesian cases. I think I very interest about how we can to measure and to choose the first or the second public policy, or if the matter or problem shortcoming or handicaps about the first one, and then we must to move to the second public policy, or we try to keep separate times to use the first, and then we try to get if any fails, and we get the second choice of the public, the best of public policy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Heri. Please directly.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, as I was making this presentation, I was making that decision. Like, should I make a prescription that we should start just thinking about second best policy design? But just to quickly answer, I would suggest that it's a process by which you start with the first and then you adjust. So learning is an important aspect of this one. Because there is a political function to the first best design. It's really the aspiration. It's one way to convince people that this is gonna work. But the second best design comes in when we are now thinking about, is it working? How do we make it work? So this is like where the discussions about substantive versus procedural elements of policymaking matters. The first best design is about making the substantive element correct, the content. Like, are we introducing the best possible solution? But the second best policy design talks about the process of designing. that if that solution is not working, we change it. The point that I'm trying to make here is that there are two conditions that make this solution likely to fail, right? So we need to think about whether or not there is ambiguity. We need to start thinking about whether or not there's conflict. To some extent, our policy analysis tools allow us to do this, like stakeholder analysis, evaluation. But it's really that kind of systematic thinking that once we fail, what are we going to do now? Are we going to do an experimentalist approach, or are we going to do more of the symbolic approach where we try to just allow for the policy to exist? In some ways, there's what they will call placebo policy, where you come up with a policy that it's not going to actually make any kind of impact at all, but it's just for the sake of it being there. There is also an element of what we call decoy policies. I don't know if this is the case also in Indonesia, where you introduce policies meant to improve the likelihood of taking up other kinds of policies. So it's meant to fail, but also serves a different kind of function.
As you mentioned that about the best, the second best policy divided into four. The first is administrative policies, and then and then the next political, and then experimental, and then symbolic and experimental. How we can move one to another? What condition? What is indicator? What is more detail about if we choose first administrative policy, and then we jump or we shift or we the next to political policy, and then symbolic, and the last is about experimental, because it's confused with we and changeable about politic and administrative or symbolic, or symbolic if you refer to qualitative policies or refer to quantitative policy, that you must to how to measure about the fourth combination. Okay.
Great point. There's no measurement. And the idea of ambiguity as an unmeasurable kind of thing is really contingent on assessment of the individual professional. So in that sense, it's hard to make a forward thinking kind of flow. Like there is a threshold that, it's too ambiguous now, we should do this. I think the point of the framework is to suggest that there are different ways to think about it. So for example, in the context of the conditional cash transfer, when at a certain point during the time of Duterte, it was seen as too controversial, that we shouldn't be giving money to the poor. And that's sort of like the media discourse. But they managed to change the narrative by saying that, yeah, we'll remove those who gamble the money that we give. So in some ways, it allows the concessions. So there's really no way to purely come up with a quantitative measure on high levels of conflict or high level of ambiguity. There is a certain threshold of ambiguity and conflict that policies can tolerate. But if it's, for example, at the heightened level of like issue salience of we shouldn't be giving money to the poor, then I think that's something that requires shifting policy designs. So it's not just purely about implementation, as I'm trying to suggest, that it's also about the instruments that we use. So in this context, there was another kind of revision of the policy design was when they included unconditional transfer. That's not part of the original design, and that's a second best design, because according to literature, the most effective is really conditional cash transfer. So the moment you tweaked it, it's really a concession about high levels of conflict. So unfortunately, there's no measure of conflict or ambiguity, but it's really based on a certain type of policy judgment.
Very much. Yeah, please, Annette. Kindly introduce yourself first.
Terima kasih Pak Eko dan kawan-kawan dari UI. My name is Amanda. I'm from Monash, Indonesia. So actually, I've talked to Kidjie about policy capacity and how the idea of policy is non-ideal when you are talking about the first policy design, because it's too idealistic and it's not realistic in the sense that there are a lot of ambiguity and there are a lot of conflicts. I like the idea of second best policy, where it's much more grounded and much more messy and complex, and it really captures how Indonesia policymaking processes works. But then how are you going to push this further into the scholarship of the Global South, where the policymakers themselves are still seeing that, oh, evidence-based policy is the catchphrase, is the gold standard, and they are not looking into, for instance, the multiple stream framework by Kingdon, and they're like, no, we have to follow policy cycles and all that. So how are you going to push your idea into the Global South perspectives? I think, Kidjie, I think that's my first question. The second one will be that I grasp the concept of how the political knowledge become like the source of evidence to redesign the policy in the realm of the second best design. However, like the political knowledge itself in this global south context are very much gained from the non-state actors, like the NGOs are the one who are reading the room and like they are grasping the political notions other than the policymakers themselves. So but I remember your design mentioned about how the co-designing is only for the high ambiguity and low conflict case. So what about the other cases or the other contexts where the NGO and the non-state actors are requiring to give those political knowledge?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I think that's a great point about how to push. One of the things that, and it'll be interesting how it will overlap with Ben's point about long-term policymaking. There is value to, for example, development planning, and I think development planning as a tool is very strong in a lot of global South countries. And what I wanted to suggest is that we probably have to rethink the idea of development planning as a process by which I determine the ideal set of policies. I would suggest that it's policy contingent. It's a level of the subsystem, level of the policy sector, rather than like a whole of government approach. Partially because it's been called a simulacrum. It's like it's an idea without any form of reality. No, so and if we're using development plans as a way to exact accountability, then the government will always fail, and it will always undermine government's credibility and capacity to implement. So I think I'm using that as a way to change the narrative that we need to think about how we determine our aspirations and our ideals. This example that I have on conditional cash transfer is really based on an example where I don't know if also the case in Indonesia, where the government does not have 100% understanding of who is the people, who are the citizens. And so it operates under incomplete information. And that's the case with the Philippines in terms of its understanding of the poor. They don't know who were the poor. And it's correct, like they would rely on non-state actors. Pre-2007, they would commission civil society organizations to identify the poor. But what happened here is that they came up with a system that's a technical form of knowledge, and they came up with a political knowledge that allows for sort of cross-referencing, triangulation of the technical knowledge. So technical knowledge in that sense is incomplete, and it's more complete as a result of this political knowledge. And one thing that is quite unique to this program is that there is street level bureaucrats that would implement the program. They're called community links. So they're the ones who would go to the remotest islands because, and they're the ones who are managing the program at that street level. And that's not common in a lot of policies in the global south. Street level bureaucracies are pretty thin in a lot of the global south. So I think this is fairly different in the sense that they don't have to rely on civil society for that kind of information. Yeah.
Everyone who is attending online, any questions or something you'd like to say? From Mario, please. Mario, could you hear me, please? Hello?
Hello,
Yes, you're hearing me?
is
Hello,
my
Mario?
voice
Yes,
clear?
please, please.
Okay,
It's your
thank you.
time.
Thank you, Doctor. Good morning, Dr. Kidjie. I'm Mario. I'm a postgraduate student, class of 2024. Thank you for insightful presentation and discussion. In this time, I would like to raise my concern on Timor-Leste context, especially on route widening project that now is implementing across the Timor-Leste, especially in Dili, as capital of Timor-Leste, you know. So the objective is clear it is related to policy goal that to improve basic infrastructure, reduce congestion, which getting worse over time in Dili, especially in capital Dili, and yes, also to support Timor-Leste economic development. That's for me is like it's no doubt because it's technical sound, right? So but the problem is the implementation itself. As communities, majority of communities resist land acquisition. Compensation is delayed, and informal economic like small shop, and also the big ones are disrupted or affected by the implementation of this project. For me, it's like how to say, good policy become socially contested in this economic asset, but I think also part of the cultural identity and also the as survival for majority of Timor-Leste's population. So my question is, in this case of Dili's route widening project, as compensation delay and informal land system created resistance from majority of the communities living in Dili, how can second-best policy balance urgency of the infrastructure development with social legitimacy without reinforcing weak institutional practice? Thank you, Dr. Lynch.
Yes, I think Dr. Kidjie, you could hear as well. Yep.
Yeah, so I think just based on how I understand your question, I think one crucial aspect that we need to think about is information asymmetries in the global south, in the sense that in your example, for example, of the road widening, there is an issue of understanding of how much land, for example, can the government procure, who owns that land, uh, and to what extent is that land contested, right? So like going back to the idea of conflict, that land is essentially a very conflictual resource, and the government ability to extract land, expropriate land is always contested in the global south. No, so I'm not talking about Singapore, for example, where 90% of the land is owned by the government. In a lot of global south countries, the land where infrastructure is based is largely contested, and that's partially the reason why it is delayed. So it's not so much an issue of implementation, right? So it's not so much the fact that they couldn't construct the road. It's really because the resource itself is contested, and the point of the matter here is that we need to consider first the amount of conflict that road construction actually will result to. And at the same time, because I think in this context, there's less ambiguity in the ability of the government to construct the roads. Uh, yeah, so I think that's what I wanted to do. Is like there is an implementation element to poor ability to deliver infrastructure, but I think when we think about infrastructure, it's based on other types of resources that we fail to think that are actually conflictual. No, especially in this case, land I think is very conflictual. Where we construct roads is very conflictual, and so I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not just enough to aspire for road to be constructed. We need to start first by thinking about to what extent will this introduce new sort of conflicts. No, and in order to address that, in order for roads to be better implemented more quickly, we need to find ways to resolve the conflict before we actually implement the project. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Mario.
Well, thank you so much, Mario. Uh, Do you hear
Thank
us
you,
well?
Dr.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen and dear participants, because seemingly it's 1 minute left in order to end the session here, I think this is very quick to have the discussion. So before I end the session, I'd like to have Professor Eko, there is a word that you'd like to say in terms of the discussion here before we end our session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kidjie, for the presentation about the second best implementation. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I think we learned so much from the case that you explained, yeah, in the poverty alleviation program in the Philippines and so on. Yeah. So yeah, my observation sometime in designing policy, so we focus very much on evidence, yeah, scientific evidence, and also political interest from the politician and so on. But in the implementation process, we are focusing on for example, the collaborations among the ministries, yeah, the capability of civil servants, yeah, the culture, and also the multi-level governance, yeah, between central, provincial, also local governments, yeah. So I think we learned that the best policy is not only coming from the scientific evidence, but also coming from the problem of implementation. So how far we are very sure to implement the policy in the practice. Yeah. So not the best policy is the policy that can be implemented. Yeah, I think not the policy that cannot be implemented. Yeah. So by learning the implementation of policy, we could give feedback in the policy design. Yeah. So what kind of constraining factors, yeah, in the implementation of policy. Yeah. So I was in the examinations of a doctoral degree in Tampere University. So it is it was a very interesting topic of dissertations, how the ASEAN Economic Community Agreement can be implemented in Indonesia. So especially in the movement of labor movement, yeah. So very difficult using the Maitland framework, yeah, to assess between the ambiguity and also the conflict, yeah, how we can because if you ratify the global international agreement, you have to make the national policy. So in the case of labor policy based on the ASEAN Economic Community Agreement, it is not easy, yeah, to make a single national policy on labor, yeah, because it should involve many ministries, yeah. Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Small Enterprise, and so on. and there was so much conflict here among the ministries, but also the ambiguity how to define this agreement into the national policy. And more difficult is to implement this national policy into the local policy, because they have to define their own local policy. It much difficult to if it is related to the implementation or ratification agreement, it's more difficult in the policy, because you have to take attention on the philosophy and the instrument and so on, and how do you combine this agreement into the national context and also local context. So thank you so much. I think we learned so much from Dr. Kidjie. So I hope that we can use this information and knowledge for improving the quality of designing of policy as well as the implementation of policy. Thank you so much. I give back the word to Mas Yanis.
Well, thank you very much. Let's have a big applause first. Yeah. So I just would like to highlight from this session that now we have two best policy design. And then coming back to how we choose among the two, like Pak Hera has said before, it is based on the context as well of the policy, because every region has different context in order to develop this kinds of policy. And a good policy is that a policy that can be implemented, like what Professor Eko has just addressed. Again, thank you very much, dear participants, for attending this session, for attending here, also attending in an online session. I would like to dedicate my appreciation to every one of us. Dr. Kidjie, thank you for having you. Dr. Ben, thank you so much for having you. And then every one of us. For the rest of the time, I'd like to dedicate it back to Dr. Krishna. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Janice, for moderating our discussion. Bagi Bapak Ibu yang bergabung secara in person, terima kasih atas kehadirannya. And so thank you for everyone for joining us online. And I would like to remind you that we have also similar session tomorrow related to public policy. And I just copy the registration link at the chat box. Please kindly register to our public lecture session tomorrow. You're very much welcome to come in person in our campus here in Depok at the 4th floor of this building. And also, if you like to join us online for tomorrow's session, that's fine as well. Thank you so much. I think that's all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mohon jangan lupa untuk mengisi daftar hadir ya Bapak Ibu.